Welcome, welcome, welcome in everyone. Welcome to Care Concierge with Carepatrol, where education is the heart of everything that we do. Today's topic, which like all topics that we provide, was suggested by a former attendee to one of our courses. And today's topic is complicated grief. And so we appreciate all of you taking time on this overcast Friday to join us. We hope you stay dry this weekend. Some of you may be new to Care Concierge or Carepatrol, and you may not know quite who we are. We are a aging care navigation company, and we might do any number of things from helping someone determine which Medicare plan might be in their best interest, helping someone find elder attorney care, helping someone find skilled care for rehab or outpatient rehab or home health agencies. Today, I met a woman at the hospital at 7:30. She discharged, and I drove her to her new home in assisted living. And so those are the types of things that Carepatrol does. We're paid by providers, so we're free if you refer your patients, friends, or clients to us, and we'll talk them through their issues. And if they end up placing in assisted living, we would be commissioned. And if they did not, we would not. So that's who we are. That's how we do things. Appreciate all of you. Hello, everyone who's saying hello. Thank you for being here. As always, I recognize your names. Let's get into our housekeeping for today. Today's topic, complicated grief. We encourage here discussion, and we encourage you to add your voice to mine. And I think that we all profit and are enriched by having your voice added to mine. I think everyone appreciates it when you join in. You can unmute by moving your cursor to the top or bottom of your screen. A black bar will pop up. You'll see a mic. Click on that. You can also click on the chat room on that bar and add your voice in that way. But however you do, we hope you do and encourage you to join in today. You must complete our evaluation if you wish to receive credit for today's course. And that evaluation is password protected. We will give the password out about 12:55 or so. And there are often folks who are kind enough to remind me when I get forgetful. And so we'll give out the password at the end, but the evaluation must be completed in order for you to receive credit. We're accredited by the Alabama Board of Nursing, as well as by the Alabama Board of Social Work Examiners. In fact, we just renewed our Alabama Board of Social Work credentialing to provide these hours. And this, if you are a social worker, is considered a live or face-to-face hour because of our password system. Those of you who have been with me know that I will read to you now the evaluation link so that you may have it. Some of you I know participate by phone or on a screen, or you otherwise aren't able to see what's here. But the evaluation link today, which I have posted in the chat room as well, is https://www.surveymonkey.com/all uppercase letters, N as in Nancy, 7, N as in Nancy, 5, V as in Victory, F as in Frank, 7. We've had some new people join us, and so for you who've just joined us again, I will read the evaluation link, which is password protected. We give the password at the end today. You must do the evaluation to receive credit for today's hour, and it is live credit if you are a social worker. That address is https://www.surveymonkey.com/lowercase r/all uppercase letters, N as in Nancy, 7, N as in Nancy, 5, V as in Victory, F as in Frank, 7. That's today's evaluation link. We'll be loading nursing hours to the ABN site for nurses who are present today. Social workers, the board asked that we allow you to load your own. Let's get started in today's topic, which I'm excited about. It's complicated grief. It was suggested by a former attendee to one of our courses. And we hope that if you do, or when you do the evaluation today, that you'll leave us your ideas for coursework you'd like to see us address. We're going to, as our objectives, our first objective today will be to list at least 2 conditions that mimic grief, but are not grief. Our second objective will be to list at least 2 types of grief and the symptoms. And then our third objective today will be to discuss the symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment of complicated grief. Now, I have noticed that you all have been very candid in your evaluations in the past, and that I have fallen down a little bit in meeting my objectives. And so I want you to be very blunt and let me know how I can improve if you feel that I don't address these objectives properly. Complicated grief. As I said, I love for you to enter into the discussion. So we'll tee you up right now and ask, how exactly do you define grief, and what are its qualities? How do you define grief, and what are its qualities? And we again encourage you to enter into the chat room your thoughts, if you have any, or share your voice with mine. How do you define grief? What are its qualities? For the purposes of our discussion, Ms. Alexander says it's sadness, and that's certainly true. Ms. Fordyce says a significant sense of loss. Ms. Wright says mourning the loss of someone or thing. Darla Dean says profound feelings of loss, sadness, a feeling of being void. That's a very interesting image. Guilt, says Kimberly Jackson. Ms. Johnson says intense mourning. I'm glad you left us with that, Ms. Johnson. For the purpose of what we're going to discuss today, let's say that bereavement is the experience of loss. So bereavement is the act of the death and loss of someone and the experience of going through that. Ms. Fuqua says, my conception of grief shifted after I started working in hospice. I believe it's one's reaction to any type of significant loss, not just the loss of a loved one. And that is spot on, Ms. Fuqua. Ms. Smith says the physiological feeling of loss or sadness due to a significant event. And you also, Ms. Smith, are spot on. We're going to discuss that. Ms. Sigger says sadness of a loss. For our purposes today, we're going to suggest that mourning is a psychological process. It's in fact a series of psychological processes set in motion like the tipping of a domino in the act of bereavement, in the act of experiencing a sudden or not even a sudden, but any loss, and then reorienting oneself to the world. Grief, then, in our definition, is a psychobiological response to bereavement, to the act or the experience of having lost someone. And grief is a blend of yearning and sadness. It includes thoughts, memories, and images of the deceased. Mr. Fisher or Ms. Fisher, Taylor Fisher, I think grief can sometimes be worse when you have anything unresolved. So true. And let's remember then that we may sometimes encounter folks, or we may ourselves experience acute grief. Acute grief, like grief, is a normal reaction to loss. It does not require clinical diagnosis nor intervention. And let's do remember that grief is permanent. However, the all-consuming intense nature of grief should moderate over time, and that grief become less intense. So the symptoms of grief may surprise you in some ways. Dizziness and shortness of breath, tightening of the throat or chest. And you should note here that it is not uncommon for people to experience a heart attack when in the bereavement or mourning process. We know that, like stress, for example, or anxiety or other disorders, grief can weaken the immune system. It can cause us to have issues with regulating our sleeping and eating patterns, as well as cause us to either be extremely restless in almost, again, a searching pattern, or the opposite, staring into the void and doing nothing. The mental symptoms that we attribute and associate with grief are confusion, and that's interesting, isn't it? Irritability, anxiety, and an inability to concentrate. But here, this is interesting, changes in metabolism. And there are those who, in a normal process of grief and grieving, do experience depression and even at times paranoia. They may have difficulty remembering or have gaps in their memory. And it is very common, it's ubiquitous, in fact, for those who are grieving to engage in searching behavior. And what we mean by this is that they're looking for their loved one. And this might be, for example, taking an article of clothing or a pillow. It may be going by someone's workplace or home. It may be going to a restaurant you like to frequent together. It would be any activity in which you sought to somehow have that same emotional connection with the person as you did when they were alive. And it's not uncommon for those experiencing normal grief to even have hallucinations of the deceased. And of course, we would expect odd dreams. What I guess we need to also realize about grief is that it is commonplace. 2.5 million people die every year in the US, 60 million people die worldwide, and each of those deceased leave behind 1 to 5 close attachments. And so if you play that out, if 2.5 million people leave, let's say, 3 attachments, that's 7.5 million people grieving at any time in our country. And one of the ways I think that we find that people do process grief is that when someone dies, they leave behind a number of items that need closure. And so, whether it be the sending of death certificates or the funeral and burial itself, the selling of a home, the selling of possessions, a lot of that allows us to process our grief. It is a natural sort of release. And I think that the doing of that makes it notable then that most of these 7.5 million people or so do not really have long-term consequences from their grief, from the bereavement process. And so, because it is sort of unusual, then we're suggesting that complicated grief is worthy of your knowledge, and that we need to learn together how to distinguish complicated grief from some related or seemingly related disorders like depression or stress disorder, panic disorder. We, in fact, would suggest, and we will at the end, that complicated grief ought to be listed in the DSM as a disorder. Ms. Scott, this presentation will be emailed to you along with your certificate. And yes, you're perfectly able to use it in any way that you choose. If it can enrich or benefit your life or someone else's, please use it. What distinguishes, y'all, normal grieving or mourning from abnormal? And those are odd words to apply to grief, but what is a natural or a normal grief? What distinguishes it from maybe something else? Well, mourning, as we defined earlier, is the process by which we seek to find ways to get our life back together when we are bereaved. And from a clinical perspective, mourning is, as we said earlier, an array of psychological processes, but we can roughly group these into two camps. One is emotional regulation, and the other is the learning processes or the ability to adapt. So successful mourning, and what we asked was what makes it successful or normal? Successful mourning leads people to, at one time, feel deeply connected to the deceased, while at the same time able to see a future without them. And so someone who is successfully mourning or completes the process of successfully mourning will become re-engaged in daily life, reconnected to others, able to experience hope and joy again. Their grief will have been transformed and integrated. They will have effective emotional regulation, and they will be able to adapt and assimilate new learning into their daily lives. Now, let's talk a little bit about mourning and and how it works. Our loved ones, whether they're living or dead, exist in our long-term memory. Think about it. Your children, your mother exist in your long-term memory. And we have different kinds of memory, and your mother or your child are housed in all of them within this long-term memory. They're interconnected. There's episodic memory, which is, as it sounds, it's remembering an event or activity or time. There's semantic, which again is what it sounds. It's remembering something the deceased had said, or a common phrase or joke that the deceased had said, or something that they had told you that stuck with you. And then there's implicit memory. Now, implicit memory would be when you are in the mourning process and you're overcome, in a sense, by the feeling that the deceased gave you. Does that make sense? That's implicit memory. It's something that sort of wells up within us without our knowledge. It's interrelated with the others, and that's important to note. So when we have close attachments, these 1 to 5 close attachments that the 2.5 million deceased people have left, they're mapped in all of these types of memory in all of these houses. And so when someone is deceased, then all of those houses of memory have to be updated. That person has to be removed from them in a sense, or in the sense that they were, if that makes sense. So we have to learn new stories and facts about the deceased, meaning we have to begin to see them as my former husband, not my husband. Was and not is. And that's also true in our semantic memories. and learning new rules about how we talk. For example, you and your close spouse may have had certain buzzwords that you use to identify something or someone, some activity. Those go away. And so we've got to update then, what are those things and how do we call them that? And then to update the implicit memory means that we would, when we had that feeling of welling up, that we would not reward it, that we would seek to redirect it. A little bit like we might treat someone with a cognitive dysfunction. We might redirect what they're thinking. And then if you think about all of these activities, interconnected, interrelated, taking place in the grieving process, you can see that mourning is complex. It can be lengthy, it is often arduous, and it is natural. One of the challenges of mourning for each of us is that we're averse to doing so. We don't want to mourn. We don't want to be in the process or situation where mourning is appropriate. In fact, it registers to us as our own mortality, which naturally brings about in us a fight or flight kind of reaction. And we see mourning and the death of a loved one as a threat. We resist thinking about our own death. And I would say that if we thought about our death or a loved one's death, we'd be more likely to think about our own and not our loved ones. And so when we're mourning, then we have to be able to confront and assimilate the information that this loved one is gone, that our mortality is here. We have to confront that reality while we're being assailed by a host of negative emotions, including fear. And it may then, because of that flood, overwhelm our ability to regulate our emotional being. It may then cause us to seek escape or avoidance of the knowledge or the thought that our loved one is gone. So with mourning, we think it's necessary then to reappraise these negative emotions that are flooding us so that they begin to abate. So the way that we would go about doing this, emotionally regulating ourselves in the process of mourning, would be that we would extinction, we would no longer reward that implicit welling up memory, and instead we would revise it with other memories. Now, this is similar to what you might think about with cognitive behavior therapy, where we would suggest that someone, when a negative impression or emotion comes to them, that they immediately replace it with some positive counter argument. And then with our explicit memory regulation, we have to focus on reflecting upon ourselves and our loss, reappraising our lives after that loss, again, finding ways to distract our thinking from a negative pattern and to regain our emotional and problem-solving abilities. And all of these must be employed to mourn. And when we successfully mourn again, the finality of our loss is assimilated into our long-term memory, the explicit and the implicit, and it is permanent. It may become housed as a new memory, one that's not as painful in our memory, but it will always be a flavor in our lives. Grief is permanent. What conditions do y'all suppose might mimic grief, but not be grief? Now, when we talked about in the beginning here, how do we define grief? And some of us said sadness. And so we're going to say, what conditions mimic grief, but are not grief? PTSD, Ms. Scott, Ms. Wright, depression, Ms. Clardy, depression, Ms. Green, depression. Y'all We could just about skip the next 10 minutes. Y'all got it down. Depression is a mental disorder. Grief is not. Depression inhibits our capacity to experience positive emotions. Grief does not. Depression biases our thinking in a negative direction. Grief does not. Depression interferes with our capacity to care about other people. And while grief may turn us inward, our desire to be with others is well preserved. Depression requires treatment. Grief requires reassurance and support. Bereaved people are sad because they miss a person they love. Their light has been turned off, and it's suddenly they don't know how to turn the lights on. Depressed people are sad because they see themselves or their world as fundamentally flawed and without worth. They had no light, nor color, nor warmth. There is no light to turn on. They are not related, although depression can be a comorbidity that leads to complicated grief, and it may predispose one to complicated grief. It, however, is not grief. So complicated grief symptoms may overlap major depressive symptoms, but then normal grief also overlaps normal depression or sadness. Depression can co-occur, as we've said, with complicated grief, and it will exacerbate the symptoms of complicated grief. The negative cognitive bias that is inherent and implicit in depression increases one's tendency to ruminate on the death and on the circumstances. The depression, as we know, will sap someone's energy, their ability to confront, adapt, and relearn, and it will interfere with their interpersonal relationships. Again, we've said that when grieving, we seek support. No one grieves alone. Complicated grief symptoms are focused, hyper-focused on the loss, to letting somehow the deceased down. Where in depression, guilt is a pervasive and multifaceted thing. It's not related to a specific event, or in this case, death or person. When we grieve, we do not lose our self-esteem or self-worth. Depressed people have neither. And then here are the symptoms not seen in major depression. Someone has their mic on. Please mute.
Actually, was supposed to call and let us know.
Ma'am.
Oh, I don't know. I'm sorry. That's another county, maybe, but not.
Mr. Bose, can you turn your mic off? Thank you. Mr. Bose, I'm going to have to mic everybody. Mute. Mute. Okay. Excuse me, y'all. I'm sorry to be detained. Grieving maintains our self-esteem and self-worth. Depressed people have lost faith. And when we see what we see in grief, we do not see in depression, and that is this yearning or longing quality, in this case for the deceased. We don't see depressed people yearning to be reunited with the dead. We don't see depressed people feel a desire to be close to the dead. We don't see intrusive thoughts about the dead with depression, and we don't see efforts to avoid reminders of the loss in depression. Now, these all may be qualities that are in depression, but they're not necessarily the same. People with complicated grief in the end feel that the world would be made right again if only the deceased could reappear. People with depression have no illusions. about life being made right. What other comorbidities might negatively influence the grieving process? I'm sorry, y'all, I'm having some technical difficulty. Occasionally, differential diagnoses are related to grief or related to anti-anxiety disorders. So people with complicated grief do suffer from anxiety. Some experience panic attacks, and others just develop an uncontrollable, unabating, and excessive worry. Anxiety, PTSD, OCD, Ms. Clardy says. Ms. Siggers says medical condition. That's a good idea, Ms. Siggers. We're not going to touch on that, however. Now, the people who have complicated grief may have anxiety disorder, may have panic disorder, and certainly it will elevate if they already have these. The thing is that both persons, again, may avoid others. The person who's in grieving process may feel like the odd man out there without their partner. And so we need to decide which of our symptoms we're going to discuss are complicated grief or some other disorder, or the presence of both and. Ms. Scott says mental health stability prior to the loss. Exactly right. Exactly right. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we know to be a serious disorder. It was included in the DSM-3 in 1980. And essentially, when we experience a traumatic event, our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland both send out a rush of stress hormones, again, causing us the fight or flee response. The majority of us move on after the trauma, but some can remain on alert for weeks, months, or even years. 3.6% of the US have PTSD. This is about 9 million people. So greater than the number of people who might potentially be in mourning. People who have PTSD experience, and this is interesting, y'all, and you'll see the relation here in a second, people who have the diagnostic criteria for PTSD experience intrusion symptoms, meaning that they have triggers of whatever way or nature that take them back to that sense of fight or flight, danger, trauma. These might be flashbacks, they might be dissociative reactions, they might be nightmares, but they are omnipresent with those who have PTSD. They avoid anything that reminds them of that traumatic event. This might be people, it might be places, it might be situations. They engage in negative self-talk. They have feelings of guilt about what happened or blame for what they should have done differently. And it affects, it affects their memories and their interest in life. And then again, it can mimic the same thing as grief, which is a panic attack, sweating, shaking, dizziness, chest pain, unexplained aches and pains, or fatigue. So PTSD, as we'll discuss it further, you will see has much more in common with grief than does depression. And will everyone please check your mics and make sure your mic is not on. This happens especially sometimes with people who are participating by phone. Thank you so much. Excuse me. So when a death is violent, complicated grief also needs to be differentiated from PTSD. When you experience the traumatic and unexpected death of a loved one, you may experience PTSD, but it is not necessarily complicated grief, although there is overlap in symptoms. People with complicated grief experience intrusive thoughts of the deceased, but they do not have any sense nor fear of personal danger. So complicated grief, like PTSD, is a specific response to a specific kind of life event. The physical trauma of PTSD and the fear of physical threat is very different from the specific event that is death and loss. Let's talk a little bit about this. Physical trauma is contained and limited in space and time. Well, that's kind of a hard concept, so let's try and make it a little softer. You have an altercation on Tuesday at 4. That's the traumatic event. Wednesday at 4, it has lessened some in intensity. The following Tuesday by 4, it has lessened even more so. And a year from that Tuesday at 4, it has reduced even more. It is locked. Physical trauma is locked and contained and limited in space and time. And the distance from that space and time in most of us reduce the sense of threat. Therefore, we do not develop PTSD. However, death and loss are unending, like grief. They are never over. And so our response to loss is different from our response to danger. The traumatic event may have happened Tuesday at 4, and Wednesday at 4, we may be further from it. But Wednesday morning, we wake up after the death of someone Tuesday, and our first thought is the death of that person. And Thursday, our first thought is the death of that person. And Friday, our first thought is the death of that person. And so we don't quite lose that death like we do the traumatic event locked in space and time. So this loss, this important loss that was revisited daily, affects us. It affects our sense of self. It affects our sense of the world. We are all, or most of us, changed by the death and loss of a loved one. But experiencing trauma is very different. Not everyone who experiences trauma develops the symptoms of PTSD, but everyone, or almost everyone, who loses a loved one who was a close attachment experiences grief. Grief is natural. So PTSD is characterized in terms of its symptoms by prominent fear and anxiety. Complicated grief is characterized by sadness and yearning for the deceased. In PTSD, the intrusive thoughts and images focus on the traumatic event, and in complicated grief on the deceased. People with PTSD avoid situations and places that they feel now are dangerous, whereas people with complicated grief seek to avoid strong feelings of missing the deceased. A little nuanced difference. PTSD, someone who's experiencing PTSD, is hypervigilant. They are always on alert for a presumed threat. But with complicated grief, we are so much dysregulated that we no longer have those senses of harm even. And like depression, PTSD can co-occur with complicated grief. It can precede it, or it could, in some cases, derive from it. But in any case, if it's present with complicated grief, PTSD will worsen the symptoms and the course of the grief. Y'all, do you think There are different types of grief. I mean, we've already sort of said to you that there are. We've talked about complicated grief. We've talked about normal grief. What other types of grief might there be? Are there any that might be considered syndromes? What do you all think? Are there other types of grief? Ms. Johnson says anticipatory grief. That's an interesting idea. I'd like to hear more about that, Ms. Johnson. Traumatic grief is one type of grief. It is not necessarily, or it could be acute. It's not complicated grief, and it's a little more than regular grief, and it's the sudden unexpected loss. Would everyone again please check your mics if you're hearing my voice, especially if you're on your phone, please check your mic. Traumatic grief would be the loss of a child, the violent death of someone close, or losing a support system. So I think someone early in our talk today in our chat room said that losing, something might also be a form of grief. It might not just be someone deceasing. Traumatic grief is different from grief that happens after an expected loss, such as a battle with cancer or old age. For some people, traumatic grief will lead to prolonged grief disorder. This is another name for complicated grief. So complicated grief and prolonged grief disorder are the same thing. Traumatic grief is more likely to lead to complicated grief, but it is not complicated grief. Even though, like complicated grief, the feelings are much more intense. Ms. Fuqua, there are so many types of grief: normal, complicated, prolonged, exaggerated, delayed, anticipatory, masked, etc. Disenfranchised grief. Ms. Lipsy Harvey just experienced anticipatory grief. I'd like to know more about that. So with the symptoms then of traumatic grief, we would be looking at what could be for some people debilitating. They might not be able to get through the day, get out of bed even. The symptoms typically begin soon after the traumatic event, the sudden death of one's child, but it could not appear until years later. Now, if these symptoms persist, that I will read to you shortly, for any length of time, we would want to then think about a PTSD diagnosis. So if they relive or re-experience the traumatic event over and over and over time, we would think PTSD. And these could be any sorts of triggers. Again, it could be a smell, it could be a food, it could be an event, it could be quite anything. Avoidance of reminders of the person. So this would be someone whose child dies, who closes up their room and never goes in again. It could be when one feels very numb and sort of disassociated from life, not able to remember or not able to participate. And then it can be hyperarousal as well. So having the jitters. And you can see here's Ms. Lipsy Harvey. My sister had cancer and there were no available treatment options. The end was in vet. I'm so sorry you lost your sister, Ms. Harvey. That's so sad. How is complicated grief different from traumatic grief? And let me just say here, we've had terrific response today in the chat room, and I want to thank y'all for joining in today. I want to thank y'all, and I agree with you, Ms. Johnson. Condolences to Ms. Harvey. How a complicated grief different from traumatic grief? Oops. Well, complicated grief, the painful emotions are so long lasting and severe that the person doesn't recover nor resume. We all follow different paths through grieving, and naturally when we are grieving, and normally when we are grieving, the order and timing of these phases vary, but they occur. We accept the reality of the death. we allow ourselves to experience the pain of the death and loss. We adjust to a world without the deceased, and we form new relationships that support us in ways perhaps that the deceased once did. And here it is, y'all. Here's what makes it complicated grief. Simply this: if you're unable to move through these stages after 12 months from the death event, it would be reasonable to assume that you are experiencing complicated grief. It occurs in a few people, about 7% of the bereaved. So if we said that we had 2.5 million people die, they left 3 attachments, 7.5 million people, 7% of that's about 600,000 people or so in this country are suffering complicated grief at this moment. So the different diagnostic considerations that we look at when we look at diagnosing complicated grief would include normal acute grief and major depression. And if the death is violent, PTSD, the symptoms overlap and the comorbidity is common. And this is especially true for those who are help seeking, because obviously we have data about them. The differences between complicated grief and normal grief are related to the heightened intensity of the feelings and the imagery and the negative bias and the longer persistence of the acute grief symptoms and PTSD or major depression or anxiety disorder or any of these other complicating processes. And the best indicator, perhaps for you as a clinician, to whether someone is or is not suffering complicated grief would be if their family members approach you or approach them to find a therapist. If others are seeing this persist over years, and I have a friend whose husband died 3 years ago, and he's still in this place of grief. And I think he's suffering complicated grief. And I look forward to talking to him about it when I see him again. So the chronic impairing form of grief that is brought about by interference with healing is complicated grief. The interference, again, coming from some comorbidity, being depressed or having anxiety disorder or having some recent other traumatic event. It is complicated in the medical sense due to the superimposed process that it has in altering our normal grief function and modifying our normal grieving process for the worse. Taylor Fisher says, what do you think when people say they died from a broken heart after one spouse passes and the other passes within the year? Do you think that is a real thing? I would put that to the audience, but I very much do. My uncle, who had been married to my aunt for 65 or more years, died 4 months after she passed. And in fact, when they left the funeral, my cousin drove my uncle home and he said, let's go home. And my uncle said, I don't have a home anymore without her. And he died 4 months later. I would think that, who knows if that's possible. I don't know how you could prove it medically or scientifically, but I certainly believe it. I think the way to look at complicated grief, maybe for some of you nurses especially, as opposed to grief, would be to think of it in an analogy. So if we think about a wound that has some inflammatory response that delays healing, in that analogy, the bereavement process would be the wound. It is the event, the thing that happened that causes all other things to happen. The grief would be analogous to that painful inflammatory response. Does that make sense? And complicated grief would then be a superimposed infection, which delays the healing and increases the pain. And so a person's response to their circumstances or situations in the consequences of death, if they have any of these other factors, it could derail their mourning process, which would interfere with their ability to relearn and adapt, and then prevent their natural responses from taking hold and lead them quite likely to complicated grief. We don't know what causes complicated grief. We think it's a combination of environment, personality, inherited traits, and our natural DNA and chemical makeup. We do see that complicated grief is more often occurring in females and older folks. Unexpected and violent deaths obviously would lead more often to complicated grief. We've discussed that as traumatic grief and acute grief, the death of a child, depending on the nature of the relationship and how close one is to a deceased person, that in and of itself could lead to complicated grief. Certainly, if you had, let's say, an older couple, been together quite some time, to the exclusion of other relationships, and then one dies, you can see complicated grief entering there. And we know, and many of you had commented, that any past history of depression or anxiety or PTSD is invariably likely to lead us from normal grieving into complicated grief. And as someone else pointed out quite rightly, early experiences with trauma, such as childhood abuse, could also lead to complicated grief. And think about that child with the death of that abusive parent, how complicated that relationship is and was, and how that might easily lead one into complicated grief, which is to say grief that lasts, like the pain of that abuse, well beyond 12 months. And then any other major life stressors, I think someone pointed out as well. And Ms. Fuqua says, I truly believe that the physiological response from grief can contribute to the weakening of the heart. I have heard it referred to as broken heart syndrome. Thank you for that. And we did say early in this presentation that there are people who in a grief situation do have a heart issue because there's a natural tightening anyway for some of us with the anxiety around death. And so, Ms. Fuqua, I think you were answering Taylor Fisher's question, but I do agree with you. So complicated grief is not in the DSM. There are no official criteria, no standards, no formal diagnostics. But I think we've seen, and hopefully you've seen today, that there is evidence that complicated grief is a specific syndrome. It's not normal grief, and it's not PTSD, and it's not depression. And it's intense and acute grief that cause a number of maladaptive feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And it might include intense yearning to the point of being debilitating, could be intrusive thoughts, it could be any number of things. And these are the symptoms of acute grief. Remember that acute grief, the death of a child or someone very close in a dramatic way, can lead to complicated grief. And so the signs and symptoms of normal grief are the same as complicated grief. The difference, again, is that normal grief subsides gradually over time. It fades. Certainly after 6 or more months, it fades. When grief persists for 12 months or longer, it is complicated grief. And what's interesting about it is that the intensity of it seems to grow over time and not to dissipate. It is intense sorrow, intense pain, and constant rumination over the loss. It is focused on little else It is extreme focus on reminders of the loved one or excessive avoidance of those reminders. It is an intense longing that is persistent and omnipresent for the deceased to reappear. It is numbness and detachment in those moments when the death makes it through the wall. It's bitterness and anger. It's feeling that life no longer has purpose nor meaning. It's losing trust in others. And it's the inability to enjoy life after the death, after 12 months. It may also, complicated grief may also be indicated if after 12 months, you simply have trouble getting your life back on track and doing what should come normally. If you are and remain isolated after 12 months, if you are depressed, or you have deep sadness or worse, self-blame after 12 months, if you believe you might have done something differently, better, or wrong that could have affected the death, you may have complicated grief. And if you wish you had died with a loved one, you might have normal grief. But if you have that feeling after 12 months, you have complicated grief. The complications of complicated grief are physical, mental, and social. And they will likely include depression, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, even PTSD level, significant sleep disturbances, increased risk of physical illness due to an ongoing weakened immune system, long-term difficulty to return to work and your activities, and the potentiality for abuse of alcohol or drugs. Raytarian Scott says, I strongly believe my grandfather died due to complicated grief. Thank you for sharing this. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm sorry for him, but thank you for pointing it out. We don't know how to prevent complicated grief, but we do think that counseling after the loss, soon after the loss, or anytime, frankly, can help. Talking about our grief allows ourselves to feel that grief. It brings about the natural response of tears and sadness. But if we can feel it, we can begin to unfeel it, if that makes sense. Finding a support group, and I'm sure most of you know this, but wherever you are in whichever community, if you need a support group for yourself or for a loved one or a patient, have them look at area hospices. Most hospices run one or more support groups, and they would welcome anyone attending. And that's the beauty of hospice and the beauty of that mission, in my opinion, or one of them. And then bereavement counseling, which is also a function of hospice, could help someone to put a defense up against all of these strong feelings, emotions, and rush of implicit memories to come about. Ms. Johnson says, it seems as if depression and complicated grief have blurred lines. You really can't determine when one turns into the other. You cannot, but again, remember that where the person who's depressed has a focus on self or world or the lack of, support in that, the person with complicated grief, their focus is always on the deceased. So what I think we want to do then to treat complicated grief is to conceptualize it as a condition like the wound we mentioned, in which the normal healing process is delayed. And it then prevents us from the healing process of emotional regulation and learning to adapt to a world without the deceased. So the treatment then should resolve or should target the complications to facilitate healing. And we can do a group of basic assumptions that will guide the treatment. One is, and we've talked about, grief, natural grief, complicated grief, they have the same symptoms. But we as humans possess this instinctive mechanism to be bereaved, to mourn, and to experience grief. It is instinctive. It is within us. It is a normal and natural process, and it is a component of our attachment system to the world around us and how we relate in it. The goal then for someone with complicated grief is to try and evaluate and integrate the information about the death into their implicit and explicit memory systems so they can adapt, relearn, and plan for the future. Emotional regulation is a successful part of successful mourning. We don't grieve well alone. And when we see complications occurring in others, we need to address these, or else this stalled healing process will lead to complicated grief. With complicated grief, we think that paramount among all of the interventions we might provide is companionship. We do not grieve well alone. We need to lead the bereaved to a place of self-observation and reflection to allow them to address what has happened, to process life moving forward. The natural healing that we experience that's implicit within our bodies restores us by confronting the emotional pain. When we do not confront it, we lead to complications. We can use imagery with clients who are experiencing grief to help them learn, relearn implicit and explicit memory. Remember we said implicit memory just arises within you. So if we can help someone do some imagery type exercises, perhaps they can call upon those when those implicit feelings rise. And we can support them with positive emotions. Those positive emotions are going to free them creatively to address the problem of the death. And we probably want to provide antidepressants. That's it for today. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I ran over. The code word is treatment. That's a capital T, REATMENT. I'm going to type it into the chat box for everyone to read. First, I'll type in again the SurveyMonkey link, and then I've gotten worse at typing lately. Treatment is the password. Please do your evaluation by 8 o'clock tonight if you can. I will have certificates and the presentation out to you by email tomorrow morning. We will upload nursing hours to the ABN website. Social workers, you will need to load your own. We appreciate your referrals. You can go to carepatrol.com or any of the emails on the screen before you, or call 855-980-2250. When you refer to us, please ask the person you're referring if you can share their information with us so that we can reach out to them. Thank you all for being here today. Again, my apologies for running over. It was a lot of information. I hope I didn't go too quickly. Thank you all for your very nice comments. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And before you go, LaTanya Washington is going to be here Monday to discuss self-care, and she's going to present you a 30-day challenge. So please come Monday and do this 30-day challenge with us, and we'll see if we can improve our self-care. I know for a fact that every one of you need self-care. You're in stressful working lives. This will help you. Please join us Monday. And thank you for being here today. We appreciate you, appreciate what you do, and appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great weekend. I'll have the email out tomorrow.